Okay, the museum has a wonderful collection of model ships we call prisoner of war models, and sometimes we refer to them as bone models. We'll explain that later. It turns out these models are about 200 years old. Now, in the years from 1790 to 1815, England and France were almost constantly at war. Now, during those wars, England was very successful, especially the Navy. The Navy was very successful, and they captured many French sailors. Now, that meant that they had to house and feed all of these people, and so they put them in prisons in England. At first, they put them in hulks, ships that were still floating, but were not in condition for battle any longer. They were older, so they started in that, and they might have looked something like this working in those ships. But England finally had to produce a number of prisons throughout the country to house all the prisoners. Now, the prisoners started a small industry, and that industry was building model ships that they sold to the local people, well, the English people. Now, this set here represents what most of them were built, the way most of them were built, of bone. Now you see these white models here. These are actually built from bones left over from their food. So whatever they were fed, beef, pork, chicken, whatever they might have had. At any rate, the industry developed into quite a thing. They made hundreds of these models. Shopkeepers would come to the prisons and actually buy up the models, take them to other cities and sell them. So it was quite a lucrative business. It turns out it's hard to imagine how they were able to build these models with no plans. The tools must have been pretty crude compared to what's available for model builders today, but they obviously they found them. Now, in those days, the situation was that if you were an officer, you could stay outside the prison if you promised not to run away or cause trouble, and this was called giving your parole. So all of these officers who were outside the prison, we assume had a hand in developing this industry, in that they could talk to vendors, they could find other customers, and they could find materials. As I said, now most of the models they built were made out of bone, but they used other materials, and as you can see, our models have many black areas on them. In these models here, they're actually made of, the black part is made out of baleen. We also have a couple of models that have copper bottoms. So there were other materials used, but for the most part, bone was the major material they used. Now, what they claim is, we understand is, they actually built a rough wooden shape to put the bone onto. They glued it on or pinned it on somehow, and then decorated it, as you see. Again, it's kind of interesting to think that the people that built these models, again, 200 years ago, probably saw the ship they built. There were no plans, so you assume they probably remember what they saw, maybe even sailed on these ships before they built them. But as again, it was very popular at the time, and they sold hundreds and hundreds of them. As we talked about materials, bone was the main product. We understand also that sometimes the prisoners, sailors, used their own hair for the lines on the ship. Now, all of our models don't seem to have the hair. They are probably, all the lines are probably linen thread that was available at the time. So we don't think we have any with hair on it. We have 9 models in our collection, and this is the second largest collection of this type model in the United States. I will say the largest collection of this type model in the United States is at Annapolis, and they have over 50 of them. So we're nice to be in that group. Very few museums have more than 1 or 2 that we've seen throughout the country. As I said, many prisons had to be built in England, to house these prisoners. And this map shows they were in various parts of England. Most of those prisons are no longer open, or they're gone, but there is a couple of them that still do exist, and they're still modern prisons now. But you can see there were a lot of prisoners that had to be housed. An interesting part of this prisoners doing work and building an industry, it turns out we understand that most army prisoners were housed in the prisons up near Scotland. And they developed an industry similar to this, but what they made was wooden toys. And those wooden toys are another valuable antique these days. So you can see the prisoners stayed busy throughout. So one of the amazing things, to me anyway, is that the prisoners were able to keep the proceeds of the sales of these models. We have information saying that one prisoner went home to France in 1815 or 16 with 600 pounds. 600 pounds would have been an awful lot of money at that time. Another thing is about the bones. We do know from the records of the prison, the rules were that each prisoner would receive a ½ pound of meat a day. And even in those records you could read, in parentheses it says, including the weight of the bone. So they probably had lots of bone to work with. And you can see just wonderful.